Hello and welcome. So in this tutorial we're going to have a look at while loops and how to create different types of loop in Python. So let's get idle opened, make this a little bit smaller for later on, make a new window and we can get started. So the purpose of a while loop is to run a piece of code, whether it be a line or a block of code, several times if a condition continues to be true. In a while loop, as long as the condition remains true, we're going to keep on running that code. So the simplest while loop we can do to that effect is to say while true, and true is the Boolean operator, and we add a colon at the end of the while loop. So at the end of the condition or statement we add a colon, and I'm just going to say print Python is fun. And when I run this, and I'll need to save it in the usual place, and I'll replace my old file, and it will continue saying Python is fun. And we can see that it's flashing down the bottom like crazy. This small bar here is getting smaller and smaller, and it is continuing to run, and it will not stop unless I make it. So to do so, you could close out the entire program, or if you hold Control on the keyboard and press C, it interrupts the currently running Python program as long as you are inside the idle shell. So this is very useful because you can still see the code that has run so far, and you can even save this if needed. So if you're debugging and you end up in an infinite loop that won't stop, or you end up doing something by mistake, or you cause an error, you can interrupt it by using Control C, save the output, and you can use that to work out what actually went wrong. Getting back to our section of code, if we want to stop this from running forever, the easiest way to do so is to add a break statement. So break is a keyword in Python, and it needs a semicolon afterwards, which is fairly unusual for Python, but that's how it's written. So we have break semicolon, and it will show up in orange. So when I run this, it will only run that line of code once, and then break breaks outside of the loop to the next line of code, which if we say hello world, you can see that it prints Python is fun once and then skips outside the loop and prints hello world. Now if we do want this to run multiple times, then we can add an if statement. So I can say keep going is equal to input, do you want to continue, y or n for yes or no. And we can say if keep going is equal to n, then we can break. So this is saying if they say no or n for short, then it's going to stop. So in this scenario, if I type anything other than a capital N, it continues. When I type a capital N, it says hello world, it stops. So this is one way of doing this. So you have a while true, and you keep going until some form of other condition is met, and then you use the break function. However, this can get slightly confusing. This break will break out of the if statement and the while loop. So if I add a print under here that says hello, and I type in no or n straight away, it says hello world. So this break breaks both out of the if statement and the while loop. So it will never print this line of code. It will never be seen, and it can't possibly be seen. So if you add break statements, it can be fairly confusing inside if statements, and especially if you have more than one loop on the go. So there are other ways to do this. So I could say create a variable called keep going and set this to be an empty string, and then I could say while keep going is not equal to n, then we are going to keep running this, and in that case I do not need these 2 lines of code. So the hash symbol is used to comment out code. You can use it to comment out code so that it won't be run, so anything after the hash will not be run by Python, or you can use it to add comments. So this asks for user input. We could add that as a comment at the end of the line or above the line to say what that line of code is doing, or we can use it to debug and test different theories. So if I run this now, it should continue doing the same as before, and when I type n, it stops and says hello world. So we haven't had to use that break, and we've actually used the same number of lines, or in fact 1 line less. And to me, this is less confusing as someone else looking at the program to see that that break, you don't need to have the break in there, and if you did want to print other bits inside of here, you could still have the if statement and put your print statements in there. If you really want this to be a Boolean value instead of a string, which is what we're using in here, maybe you're going to use that Boolean value later on for something else. So if this was true and this while loop has happened, then you later on want to do something else, then you could set this to be true, or in your program something else could set this to be true based on another condition happening, and then we could say while keep going is equals to true. We're going to say Python is fun, and then I'm going to create a temporary variable, temp keep going, so that the user input is separate from this variable here, because I don't want this to change from a Boolean to a string. So I'm going to say if our temporary function keep going is equal to n, capital N that is, then I'm going to set this variable keep going to be false instead of true. So when I run this, again, same as before, if I type anything but a capital N, it will keep going. When I type a capital N, it will stop. So we're creating a temporary variable to store this value, and if it's n, we're going to set the variable that the while loop is actually checking to be false, so that it is no longer true, so that it stops. Now you don't actually need to in this case say is equal to true. If you do while keep going and keep going is true, then this is effectively saying while true. So in this case, as long as it doesn't become false, it will keep going. And I can show this, and it will keep going until I type in capital N. And again, this doesn't use the break statement. If you don't want to ask the user for input, it could be based on something else happening, or when something happens a certain number of times, or even calling another function, then we could set it to be false. And if you really want, then you can still use break, and it will still break out of this loop the same way. So if I change this and put a capital N, it will still break out on the break. So we can also have this while loop have 2 conditions. So we can say that while that is true and count is less than 10, and I can create a second variable called count, and we can continue asking them if they want to continue or not, and if they don't want to continue, then it sets to false, and otherwise we're going to say count equals count plus 1, and when count gets to 10, this will stop. So when I run this, if I type this hopefully 10 times, it will say hello world, because count, this variable count, is no longer less than 10. So it will run it 10 times or until the user tells it to stop. So if I do it twice and then type in capital N, it will say hello world. So this shows that you can have 2 conditions. We have this condition and this condition, and as long as they are both true, it will keep going. We can have or as well. So as long as this condition or this condition is true, then we are going to continue going. So in this case, even if I type n for the first one, the count is still less than 10. So I can do this as long as I like, and until I hit 10 times, it will not say hello world. It won't move on. So this is saying as long as either of these conditions is true, we're going to keep going in our loop. And this is very useful. You might want to have several conditions being true, or one or the other, and keep doing something until one of those conditions stops being true. Or you might want something to only happen if 2 or more conditions are true. And if you want, you can make this more complex by adding brackets around this, and then you could add or another condition, or and another condition, and then this will say if this or this is true and the next condition is true, then we can do this block of code. So there are various ways to add to the complexity of the while loops to suit your needs, and so far we have shown the main purpose of while loops, which is for these conditional statements. So we have some variables we are comparing. We are either comparing it to true or to a string. It could be comparing an integer or comparing a float, something like that. You can use a while loop to count like this on its own. However, in theory, you should use a for loop for this. So I'm going to get rid of all of this. So if we set count to 1 and say while count is less than 10, we're going to print count. And if I run this, you'll notice that it runs indefinitely. In other words, it will not stop printing 1. So I'll have to exit out of that. To make this stop, you will need to add something to count each time. So I can do count is equal to count plus 1, and that will print 1 to 9. Note that it does not print 10 because this is saying less than 10. So if I want to print 1 to 10, including 10, I can add an equal sign after the less than sign, or you could change that to 11. However, this is a neater way of doing it. So if I run this now, it prints 1 to 10, and I could go up in 2s instead. So it will print 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. You can go up in any number you like. However, in theory, if you're doing this and you're only trying to count something, as in you're trying to do something, whether it's printing the number or printing something else or setting a variable or asking the user for input, in theory you shouldn't be using a while loop, because this is a count controlled loop, and that is exactly what a for loop is for. So if you're just using a while loop to count, you should probably be using a for loop. However, if you are doing a loop like before, where we have another condition being true and the count being less than 10, then perhaps you should use a while loop, as you can't do that in a for loop. And we'll look at for loops in the next video. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.